the RCD unit at the postgraduate school, and I will be your moderator for today's workshop. I just wanted to let everybody know that this session will be recorded, and I have started the recording. I would like to thank all the attendees for joining us today for the information section of Statistical Consultation Services and Postgraduate Fund Management. And most importantly, to thank our presenters, Dr. Richard and Mr. Tabiso. Before introducing, I'd like to go over a few housekeeping rules. Please know that if you do have any questions during the presentation, please you may raise your hand and I will indicate to the presenter so that they may address your question. And you may also type your questions in the chat box. And as I have indicated, that the session will be recorded and the presentation slide will be posted on the model communities and the feedback survey will be sent. So I would like to advise everybody to fill it in so that we may get insight on how this workshop has improved you and how we can also improve in the future. So before I begin this session, I would like to just go over the presenters' bios. So Dr. Divi is a director of Statistical Consultation Services at the Postgraduate School at the University of Johannesburg, South Africa. He completed his PhD in Development Policy and Management through the University of Manchester in 2015. Prior to this, he completed a master's degree in Development Studies at the University of KwaZulu-Natal and Biological Sciences, then University of Natal. He used either survey or experimental-based research design for these qualifications. In the role of statistical consultant, Dr. Richard provides quantitative research design and statistical analysis, support for UJ and staff postgraduate students. Prior to moving to UJ, he worked on numerous survey-based research projects, taught research method, and supervised postgraduate students in the School of Developmental Studies, UKZN in Durban. And I would like to go over as well our other facilitator, Mr. Tabiso Masango, is an honors degree graduate in the field of public management and governance at the University of Johannesburg. Currently, he's an administrative officer with 8 years of experience dealing with grants management, system administration for the NRF, postgraduate scholarship and fellowship, a professional individual who is able to perform to the highest standards in areas such as administration, report writing, customer services. Mr. Tabiso attributes his achievements to his ability to organize his time effectively, prioritize tasks, and use his initiative to solve complex problems. His ultimate goal is to provide quality services to stakeholders and increase access to funding opportunities afforded to the institution while meeting the funders' requirements. So without any further ado, I would like to introduce again Mr. Tabiso, who will begin the presentation and presenting on behalf of the Postgraduate Fund Management. You may proceed, Mr. Tabiso. Thank you.
Thank you, Lance.
Thank you so much.
May you please confirm if you can see my screen?
Yes, I can see your screen, but it's not in full presentation view yet.
Let's do this. How about now?
Yes, perfect. You can see your screen. Can everybody see Mr. Tabiso's? Can you just indicate with a thumbs up? We can see Mr. Tabiso's screen. Okay, perfect. Yeah, you may proceed. Thank you.
All right, thank you. Good afternoon, colleagues. My name is Tabiso Masango, and I'm from the Postgraduate School under the Division of Postgraduate Fund Management. And I will be taking you through my presentation in terms of funding opportunities that are available for postgraduate students. So who is the postgraduate school? So basically, the main purpose of PFM is to manage the postgraduate bursaries and scholarships. Our drive is to improve funding availability and access to funding for postgraduate students. So what do? We focus in ensuring that there is effective communication so that students are aware of funding opportunities. We assist students so that there is highest success rate for UJ applicants to external funders, and the following the following are the levels that we fund. So we fund for postgraduate diploma, honors, masters, doctoral, and postdoctoral. I'll now take you through to our internal bursaries and scholarships that we manage. So we have the UJ Merit Bursary, which caters for masters and doctoral. For masters, an applicant must be a full-time and can be part-time student and must have obtained an average of 70% to 74% for them to be eligible for 7,130 bursary. And then for those who achieve an average of 75% and above, are eligible for 10,970. And then for PhD, the doctoral, it caters for doctoral full-time and part-time. And for those who achieve 70% to 74%, are eligible for 10,970. And then those who achieve beyond 75%, eligible for 16,460. And this merit bursary is managed by Student Finance. And as you can see, you can contact either Miss Rona Kruger or Miss Yolanda to find out more about it. And then we also have the UJ Supervisor Linked Bursary for masters and doctoral. For masters, students who are full-time are eligible for 7,200 bursary, and then for part-time students, it is 3,600. And then for PhD, full-time doctoral students are eligible for 13,200, and then for part-time students are eligible for 6,600. And the deadline is the 7th of March for students registering at the beginning of the year. Application forms are obtainable from the relevant faculty officer. We also have the UJ Commonwealth for PhD only. So it caters for non-South African doctoral students who are part-time, who are full-time, and the amounts are 95,000 per annum in the first year of award, and then 80,000 per annum for 2-year duration, proceeding after the first year of award. Bursary is attainable over 3 years, since PhD is 3 years. And then we have the URC, which is the University Research Council International. We have master's and doctoral bursaries. For masters, it caters for non-South African master's students who are full-time, and they are eligible for 65,000 per annum. Bursary attainable over 2 years for masters. And then for PhD, it caters for non-South African doctoral students who are full-time, and the amount is 95,000 per annum. Bursary attainable over 3 years for doctoral. And this particular one is managed by Mr. Mlindeni Boabe. We then have the Global Excellence Data 4.0 for Societal Impact, which is the GAS 4.0. This one caters for South African citizens, permanent residents, and non-South African citizens on a full-time basis, on a full-time registration study. For masters, it's 120 per annum, tenable over 2 years. For PhD, it's 170,000 per annum, tenable over 3 years. It is intended for fourth industrial revolution and societal impact program to fund constructive, critical, and future-focused ways to ensure that South Africa can participate actively in and contribute proactively to industrial fourth revolution and the community. The program is underpinned by attracting and retaining excellent postgraduate students and postdoctoral research fellows whose research interests are aligned with fourth industrial revolution and societal impact. The next call for 2026 will open around October 2025. You can find out more about it from Mr. Mlindeni Kwame. We then have the special university masters and doctoral scholarships. So for masters, it caters for South African and non-South African students registered for full-time. Students must have obtained an average mark of 70% from their previous degree, in this case it will be your honors. Any area of research discipline would be acceptable. Scholarship value for masters, it's 80,000. And then for PhD, it caters for South African and non-South African students who are registered on a full-time basis. Students must have obtained an average mark of 70% for the previous degree, which is master's in this case. Any area of research discipline will be acceptable. Scholarship value is 110,000. And also this one is catered, it's administered by Mr. Mlindeni Kwame. Currently, there is no budget. Faculty Vice Dean for Research are usually requested to nominate when the space. And then now I'll take you through to external bursaries and scholarships managed under the Postgraduate Fund Management. We have the first round international postgraduate scholarships, which caters for South African citizens only. Students must be under the age of 35 years and should be willing to pursue their master's or PhD studies abroad. A call opens from December annually to March. Categories of scholarships, we have the first round laureate winner and first round foundation scholarships for international postgraduate study. We also have the first round Oxford African Studies Scholarship, the first round FNB Fund Education Scholarship, and the first round FNB Oxford Education Scholarship. And now we'll take you through to the NRF scholarships. The NRF is South Africa's major research funding agency, providing grants to researchers undertaking research projects, as well as scholarships or bursaries to support honors, masters, and doctoral students with research component of at least 50%. Types of funding, we have the NRF administers the following funding support through its various funding instruments. We have freestanding scholarships and fellowships. The student or fellow individually applies for support and is responsible for reporting on the utilization of funds. The period of support for honors, it's 1 year, for masters 2 years, and then for doctoral 3 years. And students must be registered on a full-time basis. NRF does not fund part-time studies. This one is administered by me and Mr. Ntokozo Manana. I'll now take you through the foreign funding components that we manage, which are the NRF freestanding scholarships. So for honors, you must be a South African citizen or permanent resident in order for you to be eligible to apply. Applicants should be intending to take full-time honor studies. As I've indicated, do not fund part-time studies. Applicants may not hold a full-time salary employment during the term of the scholarship. Students must have obtained an average mark of 65% for previous degree. Applicants should be 28 years of age or younger in the year of application. Any area of research discipline will be acceptable. And then in terms of the scholarship values, we have what we call full cost of study, which amounts to 163,892 per annum. So it's only 1 year, and partial cost of study, which amounts to 124,692. These values are 2025 values. they may be subject to increase in 2026. The call will open on the 1st of April 2025 for 2026 student intake. So no applications for this year have already been closed. And then we have the masters and doctoral one. So both the masters and doctoral scholarships, it caters for South African citizens, permanent residents, and non-South African students. Applicants should be intending to take full-time studies for both masters and doctoral. Applicants may not hold a full-time salaried employment during the term of the scholarship for both masters and doctoral. Students must have obtained an average mark 65% for previous degree. In this case, for master's, it will be your honor studies, and then for doctoral, it will be your master studies. Applicants should be 30 years of age or younger in the year of application for master's, and then applicants should be 32 years of age or younger in the year of application for PhD. Any area of research discipline will be acceptable. And then for masters, the values of the scholarship are full cost of study, it says 182,836 per annum over the period of 2 years, and partial cost of study, it is 126,836 per annum. And then for PhD, full cost of study is 188,820 per annum, and partial cost of study is 131,220 per annum. So for PhD, it is over the period of 3 years, and both masters and doctoral calls will open on the 1st of April 2025 for 2026 student intake. That will be the end of my presentation. Thank you. Any questions? I don't know if Lawrence, I can take questions.
Yes, you can take questions. If you want to take them now, that's fine, or you want to take them at the end after Dr. DV presents. If that's fine with you.
I can take them now.
Okay. Any questions? If you have any questions, dear participants, please raise your hand, or you may type in the chat box, and I will indicate the question to Mr. Taviso. So you may raise your hand. I will unmute your mic, or you may type the question in the chat box. Oh, yeah, there is a question by Sanchez. You may speak. You may unmute your mic and speak. Hi, Sanchez. You may unmute your mic and speak. I've allowed everybody's mic, so you may unmute and speak. And there is a question in the chat box. Let me just present. The question is, which of these funding options implicitly disqualifies an MBA qualification?
I don't know if I get the question clearly, but none of these funding opportunities fund MBA because it's a professional degree. So these funding opportunities do not cater for a professional degree.
Okay, there is another question. It says, please, how do you access the Commonwealth scholarships, and how do you get forms?
They may address, they may, I don't know, I'll leave Linden's details on the chat box, and then you may drop him an email.
Okay, perfect. Any other question? You may raise your hand or type it in the chat box, then I'll address it to the presenter. I see Mr. Tabizo has dropped the email for the Commonwealth bursary. The person who asked about the Commonwealth bursary has dropped the email. Says, can you please write down the email of the person responsible for the funds?
Which funds?
And they didn't specify, they just said responsible for the fund.
Oh, okay. So just to clarify, Mr. Mjendeni Kwabi deals with internal and external bursaries, and I deal with the NRF scholarships, and I'll also drop my email on the chat box.
There is another question. The person says, I applied for a merit bursary and received a 71%, but my application was rejected. What could be the possible reason?
Can you kindly send Miss Yolanda or Nakroga an email with regards to the merit bursary, because those ones are not administered at the postgraduate school.
Okay. Any other question or any hand raised? It says, hi, what is the total annual value of the supervisor linked bursary for PhD students?
Please refer to the faculty officer as indicated on the presentation, because that one is also the application forms are usually sent to the faculty officers for processing, so they may be able to respond to your question.
Okay. It's saying, hi, which email was used to send UJ honors and postgraduate bursaries?
I don't seem to understand the question, but if you are referring to a UJ honors bursary, then you must refer to the faculty, because that one is administered by the faculties.
Okay. And, someone is asking of the outcomes of the NRF bursaries. Have they been given yet?
For masters, doctoral, and postdoctoral, yes. For honors, we are busy processing and screening the applications. We are far from finalizing that, but hopefully it's
No, you're cutting a bit there, Mr. Tavizo. Network. In the number for next. Wasn't 70 inland cable.
I'm sorry. Did I
Um,
miss it?
yes, you did cut a bit there, Mr. Tavizo. Can you kindly repeat?
So what I was saying is that for honors, we are far from finalizing the successful candidate list. We are still busy screening and processing those applications. I think it's something that would be
Tabiso, you've cut off again.
And I think we're experiencing some network issues. Can
yeah,
you hear me,
sorry
Doctor?
about that.
Yes. Yeah, we can now hear you, Mr. Tabiso. You can go, you can proceed.
So what I was saying is that for master, doctoral, and postdoctoral, the results are already posted on the NRF website.
Mm. And then there's another question. Can you hear me, Mr. Tawiso?
Yes, I can hear you.
Okay. Please, I applied for GES and I have received an email that I have to put on a reserve list. Is there any hope for me?
I believe that the GS successful candidate list has already been finalized, and it has already been communicated to the faculties and the successful candidates. However, if you need any further information, then you can drop Mr. Mlindeni probably an email, and then you'll be able to respond to your question.
I hope you answered the Barry. Okay, perfect. Any other questions? In that regard, I believe there isn't any other questions for okay, there is another question. It says, can I please receive clarification? Are any of these funding opportunities still open for funding this academic year?
No, they're not open for this academic year.
Okay, thank you. Hope you got your response in the Karabo. Mr. Mlindeni there just replied, he said there is a possibility if one of the nominees do not accept the offer, depending on how reserved you were placed, GES, on how reserved you were placed on GES, yeah. I think it's that question that Barry answered. Sorry, Barry asked regarding being placed on the reserve list. So I hope you answered in that regard. Okay, thank you, Mr. Mlindeni, for clarifying that. I believe in that sense there isn't any further questions for Mr. Tabiso regarding the postgraduate fund management. So in that sense, I would like to thank, okay, here's another question. Considering the NRF age eligibility requirements of 32 years or younger for doctorate studies, would I still be eligible for full funding of the program if I apply at age 32?
Yes, if you are 32 years of age in the year of application, then yes, you are eligible. So if you are 32 this year and then you're submitting an application this year for 2026 funding, then you will be eligible.
Thank you for clarifying that. Any other questions before we move to statistical consultation services? Okay, so in that sense, I would like to again thank Mr. Tabiso for presenting there and for giving us insights regarding the postgraduate fund management and all the scholarship and bursary opportunities available. And again, thank you so much, Mr. Tabiso and Mr. Mlindeni, for providing clarification regarding that to all the participants. And thank you so much again. Really appreciate you and the RCD unit.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. So in that sense, I would like to now introduce Dr. Devi Richard to give us the information session for the statistical consultation service. I see you have already shared your presentation. Can everybody just clarify if they can see it? Can you just indicate with a thumbs up if you can see Dr. Divi's presentation there? Okay, perfect. Dr. Richard, you may proceed. Thank you.
Thanks, Guy. Yeah, good afternoon, colleagues. Sorry, I can't see my own presentation on the screen, so I'm going to be toggling between the, if I don't keep an eye on the chat, it's because I'm busy checking my PowerPoint. I don't know why it's not showing up, but it doesn't show up in the screen here. Okay, so I'm here to talk to you about the function of STATKON, which is the Statistical Consultation Service, which we're a unit within the postgrad school at UJ. So if you're doing a postgrad qualification, and if you, particularly if you're doing a quantitative project, a project that has some kind of statistics involved, you can get support from the Statistical Consultation Service. So it might be if you've just recently registered, it's very early in the process. And if you don't have a topic yet, it's quite early to be sort of thinking about getting support. But the point of this presentation is to just make you aware that that we have this service and how the service works for when you are ready to use it. Okay, so our mission is to provide a professional, outcomes-based statistical consultation service to postgraduate students, and we also support researchers at UJ. So we also support the academic staff, and we support quantitative research. So that's any kind of research methodology where there's some kind of statistical analysis that's required. We can't necessarily support every single project, depending on the design of the project, but most quantitative projects we would probably be able to support. And we give support in terms of research methodology, in terms of questionnaire design, if the researcher is using a questionnaire. We also assist with data collection and capture in certain ways, and then we also assist with statistical analysis. So if you've decided to use a quantitative or a mixed methods research design for your project, when you do your research project, I would recommend that you consider consulting with the consultation service. Okay, where do we help? We help at different phases of the research design, or let's call it a research journey. So during the early phase, when you start your research journey, you're going to decide on a research problem, and you do that in conjunction with your supervisor. So there's different ways of doing this. Your supervisor might suggest a topic to you, or you might have a topic in mind which your supervisor is happy to supervise. So there's different kind of approaches you can take towards developing your project. But at the starting point when you're developing that research problem, it's something that you do with your supervisor, or maybe more independently, but we don't really get involved in that stage. So we're not involved in that early phase of your research, of thinking about or deciding what your research problem is going to be. But then you're going to have to develop a research proposal. So you're going to have to write a research proposal based on your project or topic that you want to do your research on. And once you've got that proposal written, that's where we can play a role. So we'll look at your research questions, and we'll look at your conceptualization. We don't tell you that you need to change it, for example, but we look at it in relation to the statistics that you want to do for your project, and then we'll give you feedback on whether it's if we think you've got a project that's not feasible, for example, we might tell you that. So we act like a sort of a reviewer of your project. Okay, one of the important things about if you decide to do a quantitative project, one of the kind of core definitions of quantitative research is that you might be testing a theory. So that's it's just to kind of highlight the point of this is to highlight that if you're doing quantitative based research, you might be testing a theory, and to test that theory, you need to measure constructs or concepts, and then you're looking at the relationship between those concepts as part of your problem, the problem that you're looking at. And there's a very good resource by Wetton called Modeling Theoretical Propositions, which explains what a theoretical proposition is. And also, for example, if you're doing a PhD or if you're doing a research master's, there's usually an expectation that you add to the existing theory with your research. And the chapter by Wetton has suggestions for how you can add to existing theory. So when you're developing your research, we run some modules we run some workshops through RCD, and one of the modules is on developing theoretical propositions, for example. So if you get, you must look out for the workshops that RCD is offering. And if there's a workshop, if you see a workshop, and if you want to do a quantitative project, and if you're thinking about sort of testing a theory for your research, then that's a good workshop to attend, because it will give you ideas about what a theory is, how to measure a theory, and how to develop new theory from existing theory. Okay, so I'm not going to go into lots of detail about that. It's just to highlight that it's one of the things that you need to be thinking about if you're going to be doing a quantitative-based project. Okay, another useful another problem that researchers have sometimes is describing their methodological design very carefully. So I recently reviewed a student proposal where the student said they were using different philosophical approaches, they were using many strategies and so on, and it wasn't making sense in terms of the choices that the researcher was making. So this is another useful resource from it's a very short paper by Sanders and I can't remember the other author's name, but it gives you a structure to use for your research design. So you start with a philosophy. That's the sort of high level thinking about what kind of philosophy is driving your research, and you can choose from positivism or realism or interpretism, for example. So positivism is often associated with quantitative research. It's the philosophy which is most well aligned with quantitative designs, whereas interpretivism is much more aligned with qualitative-based research. So if you're doing a sort of quantitative project, you're more likely to be adopting a positivist philosophy rather than an interpretivist philosophy, for example. If you're doing mixed methods, that's more associated with pragmatism, for example. So the student whose proposal I reviewed was saying that they were going to be using the positivist and interpretivist philosophies, but they were actually doing a mixed methods, and that's more associated with pragmatism. So my recommendation was change your philosophy to pragmatism, because that's more logically aligned to mixed methods, the use of mixed methods. And then obviously mixed methods, and you can have simple quantitative or multiple method quantitative, and you can have mixed. There's various designs of mixed methods that you can use, which will involve a quantitative-based design. So some of you might be more quantitatively orientated, some of you might be more qualitatively orientated. That's any approach is fine to use. The key thing is just to justify why you're using that design and give a good justification. And I think Thabiso mentioned that there are bursaries which are linked to sustainability, themes of sustainability, for example. So UJ is on a big drive to do research which has meaning for society. And you can use all these different approaches to do that kind of research. So the kind of research that you're doing doesn't really determine the methodology that you're going to use. It's what best fits the problem that you're looking at. So if something's well understood and if it's been measured before and we've got good indicators measuring variables, then it might be more appropriate to use a quantitative design. If you want to be able to generalize about a population, you would also use a quantitative design. If you're doing more intense work, or if you want to understand something which is not well understood, then you'd normally start with a qualitative design to investigate that kind of problem. So the design that you choose is going to be determined by the kind of problem that you're looking at. But the important thing is to choose the correct or the most accurate methodology for what you're doing. And one of the roles that we play is that when we look at your research design, sometimes we'll get a proposal where the researcher says they're doing a survey, but they're not actually doing a survey, they're doing a case study, and we'll correct that sort of misclassification of the kind of research that they're doing. Yeah, so this is a useful structure to use for describing the research design that you're using for your methodology. Okay, another mistake that the student made was that they said that an interview is a strategy, but the interview is not a research strategy, it's a data collection tool. So if you look at the strategy bubble in this image, or the layer of strategies, you've got things like experiment surveys, case studies, action research. Those are all specific strategies that you can use to do a piece of research. If you're working in the health sciences or in psychology, for example, you might do experimental-based research. If you're working in anthropology, you might do ethnography. So there's different approaches are sometimes more often used in different disciplines. But there's a range of strategies that you can choose from. And this picture doesn't contain all of them. A good resource that has many research designs is a book by Mouton, which it's quite an old book now, but he lists a whole range of strategies that can be used by researchers, and it's up to you to decide which is the best for your problem that you're looking at. Okay, so that's it's just saying that there are tools that you can use to help you sort of structure your research design. And this is something that I use whenever I'm doing a presentation. This picture normally pops up because it's a very useful picture to structure discussion around methodologies. Okay, so once you've developed your research proposal, and if you're using, say, a questionnaire to collect data, as part of your research development, you'd have to develop a draft questionnaire. At that point, you can get a meeting with a consultant at STATKON to discuss your research design, which is the methodology that you're going to be using to tackle the problem that you want to look at. So we'll look at your research design. We look at your research questions. We'll look at your population and sampling. We'll look at your data collection instruments, and we'll look at your analysis plan. So how are you planning to analyze the data to answer the research questions? And to get input from the consultation, you need to book what we call a research design appointment with a STATKON consultant, and you do that by contacting the service. Okay, what we do is we review your proposal and your draft collection instrument, if you have one. If you're using secondary data, we would want to know what kind of secondary data you're planning to use, what it looks like, what variables you're measuring, and so on. And then we'll provide advice on any improvements you might be able to make to the design. So as I mentioned, we look at research questions, we look at what you're going to be measuring, how you're going to operationalize those measurements. What that means is, how do you go from a definition of a concept to actually measuring it? Is that measurement a good measure? That kind of thing. We look at your research strategy. Are you reporting the correct research strategy? We look at the definition of the population and the sampling method that you're going to be using. We look at the data collection instrument, and we look at the statistical analysis plan for your project. Okay, when you're new to research, it's quite difficult to come up with an analysis plan, because if you haven't done analysis before, it's quite difficult to know what to write for that section because it hasn't been done before. So often what a student might do is just say they're going to analyze the data, but they don't say much about that. And then what we'll do is give input on what kind of analysis might be possible. Okay, and then based on that, so just one of the things that you need to think about when you're doing your projects is that you have a limited amount of time to complete the work. So you're working at you're working to a deadline, and the university is quite concerned about students finishing on time or finishing. So it's important for the university for you to finish within the time frame for your qualification. So if you're doing a PhD, for example, it might be 3 years if you're full time. And then, or if it's a master's degree, it might be 2 years, for example, full time, if depending on what arrangement you have as part of your registration. So when you do research, what tends to happen is some of you will be very well organized and you'll be very efficient and you'll get things done quickly and on time, but others will struggle and you'll get behind. So the one thing that's important to remember is that when you doing your research, you need to keep on top of it. You need to keep plugging away at the work that you need to be doing to get your degree finished. So just as an example, one of the things that you need to do is when you design your research, your proposal has to go through a departmental committee for approval, and then it has to go through an ethics committee for approval. So there's 2 committees that your proposal needs to get through, and that can take time. The committees only meet once a month usually. And then if your proposal's rejected, sent back for review, it's going to delay it by another month, for example. So there's lots of delays that can occur. So you need to work as quickly as you can to get your projects up and running and on track. So, and the same thing if you're going to use the service, if you're going to use the STATKON service, there's 4 consultants at the consultation, and we're working on hundreds of projects during the year. So we're not sitting here waiting for your project to come into us. We've got other projects running all the time. So there's always if you approach the consultation to get an appointment, you must expect to wait for a week, possibly even 2 weeks, depending on what other work and what other appointments we have going on in the service. So so you need to plan for that time in your program. So if you're going to use the service, make sure that you've built in a bit of time to make use of the service. We also recommend that the supervisor attends the first meeting, and that's just to make sure that there's no misunderstandings between the consultant and the student and the supervisor. Okay, we don't want to get into a situation where we have a discussion with you as the researcher without your supervisor present, and then the supervisor doesn't know what's going on, or they tell you something different, and then there's 3 different people telling you what to do, and we're not all agreeing, we're not all on the same page about what it is that you should be doing. Sometimes the suggestions we make will be quite big suggestions for changes. So we might suggest that you change the way something is measured, for example. Your supervisor might not agree with that. So it's better that we all at the same meeting and all online, we're all on board with the same changes, that the changes are the right ones to make. Otherwise it ends up with disputes occurring between different people. Okay, the meetings that we hold can be in person, or they can be we facilitate face-to-face meetings. We can also do online meetings via Teams or Zoom. Okay, so you have options. If you don't live in Joburg and you need to have a meeting, we can arrange an online meeting so that you don't have to travel to attend the meeting. Okay, and then depending on the feedback that you get on your proposal and on your questionnaire, if you're using a questionnaire, we might ask you to resubmit documents for feedback, for second feedback, or you might get the sort of go ahead from our side that you can proceed to the next stage of your your project. We don't determine whether you go ahead or not. Your supervisor needs to do that. But we would say we're happy with what you're doing. So now you can go and get clearance from your supervisor, for example. But most often there's usually a request to see a second version of a questionnaire, for example, because the first version might not be 100%. So we normally, I think, probably for the majority of projects we support, there's usually a second feedback. It could be via electronic feedback, or it could be requiring a second meeting. Okay, so we do. But yeah, so you might be requested to have a second meeting, and again, that's another sort of more time involved in your project. Just bear that in mind. Okay, so another useful resource for your research design is a chapter by Blakey. It's a chapter from a book by Blakey called Sample Research Designs. The reason why I always use this chapter as a resource is because it's quite good, because it gives you it contains all the elements that you need to have that are important for a research design. I wouldn't say that they that have to be good, that they would be good, because you might have executed one of the components poorly, but it has all the things that you need to link the design together. So, because sometimes what happens is when we get proposals, is there might be good research questions, but then the measurement doesn't link to the research questions. So the researcher might say these are the questions they want to answer, but when you look at the measurement, the measurement isn't the same thing as the questions, as the concepts that are measured in the questions. So there's a mismatch between the different elements of the proposal. And that's why I would always sort of suggest people look at the Blakey chapter, because it has research questions, it has concepts, it has how the concepts are going to be operationalized. It explains the sources of data, the means of data collection, the analysis plan. And what I like about this chapter is the analysis is linked back to the research questions. So there's a clear link between the research questions and the analysis that's going to be done. So that's it's a nice coherent sort of example of the components and what the components should look like when you've got a sort of good, strong design. Okay, so that's just to make a point that there are resources out there to help you, because if some of you will be new to research, so you'll be it's kind of trying to understand what you need to be doing. Your supervisors will guide you and give you resources as well, but some supervisors might leave you to do your work on your own, and then you have to kind of decide what's right and what's wrong more independently. So it's because supervisors have different ways of supervising. Okay, and then this is a useful resource which I always share with students when we are doing workshops and things. This is a handout. So if you're measuring concepts using, there's different ways we can measure concepts, and one option is to use what we call ordinal questions. So the question, you ask somebody a question and then you give them a sort of a scale, a set of options based on a scale to answer the question. So you might say, so for example, for this workshop today, you might get a question at the end saying, please rate the quality of the presentation. And the quality scale would be very poor through to excellent. So you have a 5-point scale, usually a 5-point scale, but the number of points can vary. You can have 4-point scales, you can have 3-point scales, you can have 7-point scales. But this is a very useful handout because it gives you, this doesn't contain all the things that you can measure, but it tells you that you can measure a frequency. It tells you you can measure the likelihood. You can measure the quality of something, and each of those measurements, those phenomena that you're measuring, has a different scale that you can use. So when we measure quality, we can use the scale poor. I would use a different scale to the one here. I would use very poor, average, good, excellent. In this case, they've used a slightly different one, and that's fine. That's another one that you could use if you prefer that one. Yeah. So again, this is another resource that you can sort of think about using if you're doing a quantitative-based project. And if you are going to be using ordinal based questions to ask your participants to answer things. And this is something that if we have a consultation session, we would share that resource with you if we think it's something useful for your project. Okay, then once you get past that first phase, so what will happen is your proposal will go through a couple of committees, the departmental committee or the faculty committee, and then through an ethics committee. And then at some point you will get approval to proceed with field work. Okay, you mustn't proceed with field work until you have ethics clearance from your faculty. Okay, that's not, you can't, and that's another thing when if you're running late with your project, don't be tempted to go ahead and do the data collection when you don't have ethical clearance. Okay, that's a huge problem. It's just something that you mustn't do. Okay, so even if you're running out of time, rather apply for an extension and get more time than break the rule of not having ethical clearance when you start your field work. Okay, so it's up to you when you collect data. It's up to you to do that. It's the researcher's responsibility to collect data. The one way we can assist is that we offer an online survey service where if you need to run an online survey, we can. There's the possibility that we might be able to set that up and administer it for it. We don't provide the sample for you. It's up to you to find your sample. But we can set up an online survey and provide you with a link to share with a sample. You can do this yourself. So if you want to use, there's a program called Google Forms or an app called Google Forms, which is basically an online survey program. And if you want to do your own online survey, you can do that. But the Question Pro, Google Forms is fine if you're doing a simple survey. If you've got a more complex setup, then Google Forms might not be a good option for you because it's a free program, but it doesn't have it's not excellent in terms of setting up things and branching and so on and managing your online survey. So the program we use, we pay for a license for the software. And it's got very sophisticated functionality. And so if you're doing something a bit more complex, it might be an option to think about if you're doing online surveys and you think Google Forms is not going to work for you. You could also look at Question Pro as an option. Question Pro also has a free sort of licensing option, but it restricts, which you could use as well, but it restricts you in terms of the access that you have to the functionality of the program. So you might, if you're doing a simple survey, you might be able to use it. But if you're doing something more complex, it might not give you the functionality that you need. Okay, and then our services are free, but we do charge for the online survey service because we have to pay for the license. So that to recover to cover the cost that we have for the license fee, we do charge for running online surveys. Okay, if you decide to collect data using hard copy questionnaires, we offer an in-house capturing service. So that if you don't have the ability to do the data capturing yourself. So for example, if you've got a lot of questionnaires and you don't have the time, or if you have questionnaires and you don't think you're going to be an efficient data capturer, because data capturing requires very it's very sort of repetitive work, but you need to pay attention to what you're doing. Otherwise, you're going to make mistakes with the capturing. So if you don't think that you've got that kind of mindset where you can sit for a long period of time doing something repetitive and not making mistakes, then you probably shouldn't do the data capturing yourself because you're going to make mistakes. So rather get somebody that knows what they're doing. So we have an in-house data capture service where we have a data capturer who's trained for many years as a data capturer. So that's the in-house service. If you want to do the data capturing yourself, we will give you what we call a data capture shell to use. So we'll explain to you what format you need to capture the data in order to do the analysis. And that's important. So just recently I've been working on a project where I received some data which wasn't in the correct format for analysis. It had been extracted from a piece of equipment. So the equipment had measured some readings, but the readings weren't in a format that I could actually do the analysis. So we had to convert that structure to a new structure. So to make sure that you don't have problems where you capture the data incorrectly, we'll explain to you what you need to do and how you need to capture the data. So you're not wasting time later on because you've done it the wrong way. Okay, and then you also have that option of doing the capturing yourself. And then just to also say that we don't code open-ended answers. So if you have a question where it's an open-ended question where you've asked somebody to give an answer where they give a sort of sentence or a paragraph as an answer, if that needs to be coded, it's not something that we do as our part of our service. It's something that the researcher needs to do themselves. You could possibly find somebody to do it for you, but usually it's better if the researcher does the coding. Okay, so let's say, for example, you've asked a question like, why did you decide to register at UJ? And then the reasons, it's open-ended, so it gives you an opportunity to give lots of your own sort of answer in a sentence or paragraph form. That could then possibly be coded into a smaller set of responses. But the process of doing that is up to the researcher. We don't do that function. Okay. Then for the analysis, once you've got your data prepped and captured, the analysis, we do assist with developing an analysis plan during the design phase. And we can also assist with analysis when you've collected the data for your project. You can also do the analysis yourself if you're skilled in doing analysis, but we will also assist with that if you don't have the confidence to do it yourself, or if you're worried about making mistakes and things, because we don't want dissertations and papers being published with bad analysis in them. So we will guide you in terms of the analysis and help you with the analysis for your projects. And then to do that, we organize meetings again. So we have what we call feedback meetings. And then and again, if somebody's assisting you with the analysis, remember, we're working on many projects at the same time, so it does take time to do that. So what you shouldn't be doing is a week before you're due to hand in your dissertation, coming to the service and saying, "Please help me with the analysis. I'm desperate," kind of thing, because we'd have to turn you away with that situation. Okay, I'm just going to check the chat quickly. Go back here. Okay, I'll answer that question later. Sorry, there's a question about expert and mixed methods. So I'll speak to that a bit later if you don't mind. Right. Okay. So and then UJ has a site license for IBM SPSS software. But there is a limited number of licenses. So depending on the availability of licenses, you might be, if you need to use the software for your analysis for your project, you might be able to install it on your personal laptop. If the licenses are low, then you might need to use the computer labs to do the analysis, depending on the availability of the license. But we do have access to that software. UJ also has a license for Stata, which is another program. So if you're in economics, for example, economists tend to use Stata rather than SPSS as their preferred software for statistical analysis. So we have those two software applications available at the university. Okay, then so during the feedback sessions, we would explain the statistical results, and we would also provide some supporting material to help the researcher write up their results. So but you then have to, it's up to you as the researcher to actually do the write-up of your results. We don't do that writing up for you. And then also to interpret the results in terms of your broader theory, it's also up to you to link your findings back to that theoretical framework that you developed in the beginning. A useful resource that we often share is chapters from a book by Julie Pallant called SPSS Survival Guide. The book explains how to use SPSS, but it also it's actually more about the statistics that SPSS uses. So it'll explain what a t-test is and how you run a t-test in SPSS, and also explain to you how to write up your t-test. So it's a very good book that we often use as resources, but there's also other resources as well. Okay. And then if you do make use of STATKON services, whether at the design phase or at the analysis phase, you need to acknowledge the support that you've been provided. And then if the consultant is making a very significant input into your project and becomes part of your team, then co-authorship may be a relevant issue then. But that would have to be it's usually when there's a significant input with one or more components of your project, and that would usually be by agreement with your supervisor. It's not something that you agree with the consultant. Okay, then once your thesis or goes to an examiner, or you might have published a paper, and your paper goes to a journal and gets reviewed, you might get some critique that comes back on your methodology and on your analysis. And that's if you've worked with a consultant, and even if you haven't worked with a consultant, you can get a appointment to get advice on how to respond to the feedback of the examiner or the reviewer. Sometimes it's sensible critique, and sometimes the critique is not very good. So or it's kind of like meaningless. So we would sort of try and help you in terms of how to respond to the critique that the examiner or the feedback is giving you, or the reviewer is giving you. Okay, then we also run workshops. So I haven't changed the date here. In the past, we've run workshops on developing a theoretical proposition. So that's more about conceptualizing your problem as in a theoretical way, and then sort of how do you then create or what variables are you going to measure as part of your theory, and how do you operationalize those measures? That's part of that's sort of developing a theoretical proposition workshop. We also have a workshop on populations and sampling. So it's sort of what is a research population, and what methods of sampling are available to use as a researcher, and which ones might be appropriate for your particular problem. We also have a workshop on questionnaire design. So how do you design a questionnaire? What are some of the key things that you need to consider when designing a questionnaire? We have a data entry and a use of SPSS workshop. So how do you set up your data for analysis in a stats program, and how do you use SPSS? We also have a workshop on descriptive statistics. So how do you use SPSS to generate certain kinds of descriptive statistics? There's a workshop on reliability and exploratory factor analysis, and then workshops on comparing groups and correlation and regression. So those are different. Each of those will feature different kinds of statistical tests, which are fairly common in the research kind of area. We don't have there's certain things that we won't cover, obviously, because there's literally thousands of statistical procedures, and we can't provide support for every one of them. So we don't. There might be some that we don't have expertise in. There's certain areas that we don't have expertise in, because we haven't experienced any. We haven't done projects with those kinds of statistical procedures. So there could be, So depending on what you're doing, there might be. You should be able to get support, but there might be an instance where we don't have the expertise to support you. But then in which case we would let you know that, and then sort of try and identify somebody that would be able to help you. And then there is a plan to develop a sort of community and sort of modules, or sort of almost self-learning kind of modules to do that. It would be sort of taking the workshops and sort of developing them, expanding on them in a more comprehensive way. but that's not up and running yet. Okay, we do have terms and conditions. So there's certain if you approach STATKON to register your project, you'll get the terms and conditions as part of that registration. And obviously our services are dependent on the availability of consultants. So if we have consultants available they have capacity, then we would provide a service. It's very, there could be instances where the service isn't available, but it's not likely to happen. And then what we don't do is we're not supervisors or co-supervisors for you. That's not our role. We are a sort of third party consultant, but we're not a supervisor. If the consultant was to be a supervisor, there would need to be a formal arrangement through your own supervisor, for example. But it doesn't happen very often, that arrangement. We don't liaise with your supervisor on your behalf. So what that's just saying is that we don't get involved in we don't sort of communicate with your supervisor about what was discussed in a meeting, for example. That's up to you to do that. So if the supervisor is not present at a meeting, we're not going to go and talk to the supervisor about what was said during the meeting. It's up to you to kind of share what occurred or what was said and so on. We don't consult via email or telephone. We can do short communication via email, and we can have short calls via telephone, but we won't, for example, run a design meeting or a feedback meeting over the phone. The meetings are long, and the telephone isn't really and email and telephone are not conducive for sort of intensive discussions about projects, so that we don't do email or telephone consultations. We do communicate by email and telephone, but we don't do the consultation meetings via the phone. Okay, we don't design the questionnaire for you. So when you come to us, you need to have a design ready. So you need to have your draft questionnaire ready for discussion. And then we'll give you feedback and redesign. We'll probably give you advice on redesigning the questionnaire, but we don't come up with the original conceptualization of the questionnaire. That's your job as the researcher to do that. Okay, we don't collect data except through the online survey service. So we don't, some companies, for example, some research companies will collect data for researchers, but we're not a research company in that sense. We support researchers, but we don't collect data. We don't code open-ended responses, and we don't analyze open-ended responses unless they've been coded into a number. So what that means is that if we can give you a sort of listing of all the open-ended questions, but you would have to go and then analyze them to decide what they mean. We can't do the open-ended questions. And then we don't write up findings and results. So we don't do the write-ups. That's, again, your job for doing it. In terms of ethics, there's a range of ethics issues that you need to consider when you go into the field. So you need to be honest when you're doing your research. You need to maintain the anonymity of the participants in your study. What that means is that you don't collect personal information through which a person can be identified. That's a sort of simple definition of anonymity. But not all research might be anonymous. So some research you can't be anonymous because there's a couple of instances. One would be if you need to collect more data from somebody later on, and you need to link that information to the first set of information you've got. In those kinds of scenarios, you need to be able to link the information together. So you need some kind of linking variable, and that's usually some information about the person. You can do it through code. So you could give the person a code and then ask them to use that code before and afterwards. But the sort of risk with that is that they might forget the code. In which case you won't be able to match the information. So there are some instances where, and then the other scenarios where you the person or the individual that you're targeting for your study is so well known that there's no way that you wouldn't know who it was. So that's and there the person would need to give you permission to use their name, or to at least take the risk of knowing who the person was. There's also maintaining confidentiality. So a lot, but just to say that a lot of research is anonymous as well. So if you're doing an online survey, for example, and you go to you approach staff at the university, and you ask them to fill out a questionnaire anonymously, you're not asking them for their name or their contact number or their email address. So once you get the answer, you might be able to work out who it is from their age and from their gender and so on. But it's not, if you've got a big sample, it's not likely that you'd be able to work out who's who. There's also the issue of confidentiality, and that's where you are not going to share information with others. So, and when you analyze information, you're not analyzing individual people's data. You're aggregating information into a sort of a set of information. So you're not sort of targeting particular individual information, and then you're not giving that information to somebody else to use either. So that's confidentiality. You must never ask you must never force participants to answer your questions. And you must also, you can't force people to participate in your research either. So it's about a voluntary participation from the participants. It must be up to them to decide whether they want to participate or not. And so all these kind of issues speak to doing no harm. So you don't want to go into the field and cause harm to people through your actions. And that's what you need to consider. We don't sort of get too involved in the ethics of your research. Obviously, we don't. When you go into the field, we've got no control over what you do there. But we do if we feel that there's something wrong with what you've done. So there's been a couple of cases over the years where it's quite obvious that a student has fake data, for example. When we see that, we will report it. So that's just but it's not something that happens. It's something that happens very rarely. But it's our obligation from our own ethical guidelines is that if we see somebody has done something wrong, then we would report it to the relevant people, the supervisor, the faculty, and so on. But the other thing, just to note about that, is we can also, one of my colleagues, for example, had got some data which looked very suspect, but it turned out that it was just that the student had entered it incorrectly, and by entering it incorrectly, it looked like it had been made up. But it was an innocent mistake, and it was corrected, and the data was actually fine. So we also take precautions on our side to check before we go ahead and say something is wrong here. Okay, and then we also can't control what you write about the results. So if you go and write something incorrect in your thesis, for example, we won't see that. We wouldn't necessarily see that. So we don't take responsibility for that. It's up to you to make sure that you're reporting information correctly. So the consultations are by appointment only. You can get if you need to contact STATKON, I think the slides will be shared with you after the session. There's a telephone number and our email address, the statcon@uj.ac.za. As I mentioned, consultations can be in person or online. There's 4 consultants at STATKON. There's myself, there's Jacqueline de Klerk, Nisa Kuhutzai, and Dr. Debor Malloy. And then our offices are at 20 Chislehurst Avenue. So that's just across the road from the entrance between parking lots B and C on the Kingsway campus. We work in a house. This is the house where we work. It's a UJ office. And this is the map of the Kingsway campus showing where we are in relation to the campus. So we're literally just across the road from the main campus. Okay, it's not compulsory for you to consult with STATKON if you're using if you're using a very well-established research design and a research questionnaire that's been used and validated by other researchers, and if you have a supervisor who's very skilled in quantitative research, it's not compulsory for you to come and visit the service. But it can be useful to get sort of another opinion on your research, because we often look at things from a bit of a different perspective to what you might be looking at your project from. And that can be quite useful. It might make you think about things in a little bit different way. So I would always kind of encourage you to think about consulting with STATKON if you're doing a quantitative based project. And by quantitative, I mean mixed methods or purely quant or mixed methods, because mixed methods has a quantitative component. Okay, appointments are on a first come first serve basis, and you need to allow for a period of time to get an appointment, because we kind of busy right through the year these days. There's always somebody doing research, whether it's a postgrad student or a staff member. There's always somebody busy doing work. And again, your supervisor attending the first consultation meeting is strongly recommended. And in some cases, it might be required. So if the consultant has got kind of some major concerns about your design, they might sort of demand that the supervisor is present. Okay, and that's me done. So questions from my side. There was a question here about mixed methods. So the question is, does anyone have expertise in mixed methods? So as a consultant, I can give you resources on different designs of mixed methods. So in that sense, so there's a resource that I often share with researchers, which is there's a couple of important people that work in the mixed methods sort of area. And this paper, it's a bit dated now, but it doesn't really change the different designs that you can use, because it's based on 3 criteria. So in terms of the quantitative component, we can advise you. But where we don't have strong expertise would be on the analysis of so we can definitely the analysis of the quant component we can advise on. But the mixing of the analysis is where I think there's a weakness, which we don't. So I've used mixed methods myself, and I can give you an example of how the quant and qual components were sort of integrated. But I think it also depends on the design, because the design is going to influence how much mixing of the different results you're going to be using. So that's a bit more complicated. So I don't know of a mixed methods expert at UJ, but there are people that use mixed methods. And I'm not sure if RCD offers a workshop on mixed methods, but so we would help with the with the quant component, and so that's and we'd also kind of probably be able to work out whether some of your questions are being answered using a quant component, or some of them are being answered using a qual component, or whether there's going to be some mixing of the analysis. But that mixing of the analysis which I haven't seen a lot of material on that. There was actually a workshop being offered at UCT a couple of years ago on exactly that. So I'm not sure if they're still doing those kinds of things, but that would be something interesting to pursue, actually. But also the supervisor, talk to your supervisor. There might be other academics in the faculty or the department who know about mixed methods. So there should be people around that can give advice on that. Okay, STATKON doesn't, so we don't do formulation of interview questions. I have some resources which I would share on, sort of guiding on that, but it's not something that we would and if there's a mixed methods, I might go through the questions and give some feedback on them, but it's not something that we focus on. We don't concentrate on that because our main focus is on the statistics. Yeah. Just to comment as well on the qualitative side, because the qualitative side is, but there isn't an equivalent unit to STATKON at UJ, which helps people with qualitative analysis. But the library's recently appointed a colleague who is going to be doing training in the UJ has a license for a program called Atlas TI, which is qualitative software. It's software that we use for qualitative analysis. And there is a colleague, Dr. Arden Kesor, who's been appointed to do training in Atlas TI, for example, which is the qualitative component. But it's more difficult to, qualitative research is more difficult to support because it's more difficult. There are steps involved in doing qualitative analysis, but it's not like doing a t-test or running a correlation or running a regression analysis. Because you're dealing with words and you're analyzing words, so it's more difficult to. So there's a process of coding, there's a process of theme development that occurs, but it's not something that you can do as with numbers. It's not as easy as working with words as with numbers. So those of you who are planning to do a qualitative project who think it's going to be easier, you might be wrong. So, yeah, I'm just joking, but it's just, quantitative research. I think a lot of people are concerned about quantitative research because of the numbers and the statistics, and they can be scary, but analyzing words is not that easy either. So let me put it that way. They both have their strengths and weaknesses. So, but you must decide which one you want. Well, you could use both as well if you do a mixed methods design. Okay, so are there any more questions?
Any other questions? You can raise your hand or you can type in the chat box, and Dr. Richard can attend to the questions. Oh, there is a hand up. Yes, you may unmute and speak. By Safuro.
Okay, thank you very much. I don't know whether I heard that part from Dr. Richard. Now, is there any department at UJ that helps with formulation of interview questions? And the other question is, does the ethics clearing committee, does it need to see my interview questions before granting me ethical clearance, or they are only concerned with the questionnaires? Thank you.
Yeah, so yes, I sort of did answer the question about the interview. So we focus on the quantitative component of the research. So we don't handle qualitative projects at all. If your project is purely qualitative, you wouldn't come to STATKON because we don't deal with those projects. If you're doing a mixed methods and you have a quantitative and a qualitative component, you would put your project in with both the components, and I would look at I would mainly focus on the quant, but I would also look at your questions and give you some sort of advice on them, but not. It's not, our main focus is on the quantitative component, not on the qualitative component. So I have some resources that I share with students when they're doing when they're designing questions for interviews. And then I would share those resources, but I wouldn't kind of spend a long time kind of going through the questions and saying this is how you should restructure your questions or how you must reorder them, that kind of thing. We don't sort of focus on that part of your project, if that makes sense. So I suppose the answer is partly, but no and partly, a little bit, but not. It's not our main focus at STATKON. And then, sorry, you had another question. What was the second part of your question? It was about you had a question about formulation of interview questions, and there was another question you asked.
Yes, the second question was the ethics clearance.
Oh yes,
committee.
Yeah. So when you submit, so when you put your work to us, when you present your work to us, we will expect you to provide a questionnaire and an interview schedule, for example. So if you're doing a mixed methods, I would expect to see a questionnaire and some interview questions with your proposal. Okay, I sit on one of the ethics committees, and they, for one of the faculties, and they don't always. I think it's something that I think at your departmental level or your faculty level committee meeting, that's before the ethics, they would expect to see the data collection tools that you're going to be using. They should expect to look at them. Okay, because otherwise you can't judge the research properly if you can't see what's going to be measured. And I think it should be the same at the ethics committee level, but it doesn't always seem to be a requirement. And it's a question that I would want to ask at the ethics committee where I sit. I can't review a proposal if I don't see the instrument or the draft questions that are going to be used for the interview. That's my perspective. But it doesn't always seem to be a requirement. So I think you need to check within your department, or but I think it's a good practice to attach them. So because from my perspective, you can't judge research if you don't know what's going to be measured. So if you give me a proposal without a questionnaire and you say that you're going to be using a questionnaire for data collection, I need to see that questionnaire. And I can give you an example of a case recently where the researcher had submitted the proposal to the ethics committee without a questionnaire, and I didn't review it because I couldn't see the questionnaire, and I said I can't see what they're measuring. And then I did look at the questionnaire later on. I had a meeting with the student with the questionnaire, and the questionnaire had good questions in it, but some of them were designed the wrong way. So, for example, there were some questions where it should have been mark all applicable and it wasn't noted as that. So, and that means that your quality of your projects is not going to be as good. So that's So I think even if you're going through your so I don't sit on the faculty committees or the departmental committees, so I don't know what they expect from students, but I would have thought they would expect you to see a questionnaire, or to see if you're doing interviews, to see a draft interview schedule of what kinds of questions, because you might be saying something completely outrageous to somebody in the field, and we don't want you going out there and asking sort of rude questions to the participants, without realizing it. So I think that, or sort of sensitive questions which might upset the person. We want to, that's part of the reviewing of the proposals. So I think they should be included. But they might not always be required by the departmental or the faculty or the ethics committees. I hope that answers your question. So I would say, put them, if you're submitting a proposal, whatever data collection instrument you're using, give an example of what you're going to do. If it's a questionnaire, what's your questionnaire going to look like? If it's an interview, what are those interview questions going to look like?
Yeah, perfect. There is another question. You can unmute and speak.
Oh, yes. Can I use the help of AI to structure my questionnaire? Is it allowed?
Yeah, I guess. I mean, I suppose you could. You just need to be careful about. So you just need to be careful about. I mean, I've never used a AI app to develop a questionnaire myself. I think you would just need to be careful about what sources it's using to generate the questions. And the reason I'm saying that is that if it comes up with a set of questions, you need to be careful that they haven't been used by somebody who's expecting you to give permission to use those questions. So if it's, because the AI is going to be trawling the web and pulling things off, out from here, there, and everywhere. And it might be pulling from sites where you need to get permission to make use of the questions. It's not so. A lot of researchers will, or if something has been published in a journal, because questions, you can get questions from different sources. And I would be a bit worried about, and normally you need to, if you're generating a questionnaire without AI, if you're pulling questions from different sources, you would need to give the source of those questions. Sometimes you might get a whole questionnaire from a researcher, for example, who's published it somewhere, and then you would need to cite that researcher. So the only concern I would have with AI is it referencing that source, or is it just pulling it out and pretending its own? And then that's not ethical in terms of acknowledgement of the source of that question. So I think, it'd be an interesting exercise to do, to see what, if you put into AI a question, please give me a question on firm performance, for example, and then see what it pops up with. But I don't know how it would reference, if it's pulling from an academic publication, for example, is it giving the reference of the source of that question? That's the only thing I'll be thinking about. But I think in principle, you would be using AI to generate something to create a questionnaire. So you're not, and a questionnaire is not something, can be, but it depends on how you're using it, I think, as well. I think my main concern would be with citation, a correct citation of the source of that question, because AI is pulling it from somewhere. It's not likely to be creating it itself. It's probably generating it from existing sources, and I think that is the main thing with AI, is whether it's referencing, whether it's citing correctly or not. But that's a very interesting question. Yeah. There's also, just to note, there's also discussion taking place about use of social media as a source of data, and there aren't strict rules at the moment on how to do that, or what it's a kind of, because it's a relatively new area. They're kind of general guidelines, but there aren't sort of formal guidelines on what to do with these new forms of information that we can get access to. So I think we're still in the phase where we're learning to, because there's not a lot of examples of it. We're still learning how to deal with these instances where you're doing something a bit different to what we would normally do. Because the normal way of generating a questionnaire would be to look at research papers, for example, and get questions from those published papers, because that's a good source of, the chances are the questions are good. Or there might be there's some publications where they list a set of questions relative to the field that you might be working in, so you can use that publication to build questions. Or you can create the question yourself. Obviously, you can generate the question yourself. But so the use of AI to do that is, I think, quite a new thing. And we need to kind of understand what the implications are. We need to practice it a bit, and then sort of have some examples to then decide what the sort of rules of use should be.
Yeah, Dr. Dew, just to interject there as well. Just wanted to let the participants know that we will also be running workshops or trainings rather regarding the digital research tools. So we'll be having workshops regarding the ethical use of ChatGPT, navigating 1080N, AI writing softwares, and citation management tools as well. So we'll be running those workshops as well around April. So you just have to look out for our workshop advertisement and our workshop marketing. So we will be putting out those workshops and we will be having those workshops in April. Yeah,
Right.
as well. Yeah, perfect.
Yeah, I think
Thank
that's
you.
good. Yeah. So I think building a questionnaire using AI is an interesting thing because it depends on. I think it depends on what you're going to be using the questionnaire for as well. Because if it's something, I think it depends on how established the field is that you're working in. So one of the things that we always recommend when we're consulting on questionnaires, for example, is don't reinvent the wheel. If there's already a good measurement out there, use that existing measurement. So you shouldn't if you're working in an area where the concepts that you're measuring are well developed, well defined, well measured already, you don't need to use AI to generate new questions because the questions will already be there. So let's say I'm trying to think of an example. Of course, when you try and think of one, you can't. Let's say, sorry, I'm having a blank now. Let's use a psychological concept of depression, for example. So depression is a pretty well. Let's assume. I'm going to make some assumptions here. I'm not a psychologist, so I might be wrong about saying this. But let's assume that depression is a well-established concept, and there's a well-established way of measuring depression. So if you want to find out how depressed an individual is, you can use this battery of questions, and that will give you that'll give you a number, a sort of a value, which will then, if it's low value, it means the person's low depressed. If it's a high value, it means they're high depressed. So if that's already out there, you don't need to do it again. So it's not necessary to generate a new way of measuring depression. You could do it if you want to. If you don't like the way depression is measured, you can create a new way of measuring it, and then you could sort of use AI to do that, possibly to come up with questions. So that's always the first thing we look at is there already an existing measure which is a good measure, but not all measures out there are good measures. So we also you can also be critical and say, I don't like the way this concept is measured. I need a new way of measuring it. And that's where sort of putting a question to AI would be to say, how would you ask a question about depression and see what it pops up with? And obviously you wouldn't just measure it using depression as a complex construct. So you wouldn't just measure it using one single question. So if ChatGPT chucks out a single question, then it's not doing a good job of measuring depression. That's what I would comment about. So I think if you're working in a new area where there are no questions or very few questions existing, then that's where the use of AI might come in to say, where you could put in, say, please give me some examples of questions. So I think, but you've raised a very interesting question though about use of AI for generating questions, and which is an interesting kind of concept. Yeah, but I think that's just so if there's already good measurements out there, we don't need to create new ones. You just use the ones that are already there. Sometimes you need to get permission to use the measurement. Sometimes you don't. It depends on how well established the questions are. Yeah. So something like, what is your age? You're not going to ask ChatGPT to generate that question because we already have that question. It's not something that you want to. It would be a waste of time to ask that question. unless there's a big debate about what age is, and age, the measurement of age is not accurate, but I think it's pretty good. Yeah. Okay. Any other questions? Yes, one delay. I think I saw a hand. It's gone again.
Any other questions? You can raise your hand or type the question in the chat box, and we can address the question. Or if you want to comment, say something, then you can unmute your mic and you may go ahead. Oh, I said perfect. I was happy with the answer.
Yeah, thanks.
All right. So in that sense, I'd like to think everybody's happy with Dr. Divi and his presentation, and there are no further questions. You can just provide a thumbs up if everybody is satisfied with the presentation. You don't have any questions further. Okay, perfect. So in that sense, Dr. Richard, thank you again for providing us a very insightful presentation based on the statistical consultation services, and also facilitating this critical questions from the participants. And again, to all the participants, please note that I have posted the feedback survey in the chat box, and I would kindly request you to please fill it out so that we use also this feedback survey for our reporting and to see how we can improve these workshops as well in the future. And with that being said, thank you so much for everybody who was able to participate. And also please note that this session was recorded, as I mentioned at the beginning, and the presentation slides and the recording will be posted on your respective model communities. And thank you again to Dr. Divi, Mr. Taviso, and Mr. Mlingeni for chipping in and giving us this important pointers with regard to this support services that the University of Johannesburg offers. So thank you again for your participation. I see there's a hand up here, Dr. Divi. Can you answer that before we close in?
It might be for you.
Okay. Okay. Please unmute. You may speak, Mr. Shezi.
Thank you so much, the team, for the workshops. Really appreciate it. I just wanted to maybe make a point. I noticed in the last session that it says something about the owner of the account has reached the limit for the recorder. I'm not sure if you already addressed this. So some of us couldn't actually access the link, because we can access the recording, some of us at least, after the session. So I'm just wondering if you're aware, so it doesn't affect the recording.
I think
no, from our side, I don't think it will affect the recording.
Okay.
Is it the AI note taker?
No.
Yeah.
From a previous session. Yeah, I'm not referring to the comment.
Okay. Yeah.
Yeah, there was a note that said, because usually, I mean, I've been attending these sessions since last year. So
Yes,
usually
yes,
after the session's ended, we can like click on the link and access the recording. But I noticed in the last session it said you've reached your limit, so the recording hasn't been uploaded. I just wanted to make the point, so you can maybe look into it just in case it becomes a problem.
Yes, now we'll look at it. We will look into it, and we'll make sure that all the recordings are posted and everybody will have access to the recordings.
Perfect. All right. Thank you so much again.
Okay, not a problem. Thank you so much,
Okay.
Mr. Seli. Okay, perfect.
Lauren, will you be sharing the presentations with the participants after the session?
Yes, please. So
okay.
just kindly ask you to share it with us, then we will share it as well on the model community.
Okay, great, good.
Okay, perfect. So thank you again, everybody, for participating and for being available for this information session. I hope it was very insightful for everybody. And without any further ado, thank you again and enjoy the rest of your day further. Thank you, Dr. Divi. And yeah, thank you to all the participants.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you. And I will now be ending the session. Thank you.